The airplane is the safest means of transportation. Alas, even today, some of them can crash. But what can't modern passenger airplanes do? Disappear without a trace. Yet there is the story of flight MH370. On the night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 takes off from the airport in the Malaysian capital to Beijing, China. It is a regular daily flight of Malasian Airlines. There are more than 200 passengers and crew member on board. 30 minutes after takeoff, the captain of the craft will make contact with the ground for the last time. After 40 minutes, the Boeing will not only disappear from radar, it will disappear altogether, along with 200 passengers. In the end, this case will become one of the major mysteries in the history of aviation. Several countries will be involved in the investigation of the incident and the search for the aircraft. Several years and hundreds of millions of dollars will be spent, and yet no one, from the official authorities to the participants of conspiracy forums, can give an exact answer as to what happened. The Vanishing Act. In the early hours of March 8, 2014, precisely at 12:42 a.m., a Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777-200 EA ascended into the moonlit sky from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. The aircraft, designated MH370, was piloted by 27-year-old First Officer Farik Hamid, who was on his final training flight before full certification. His mentor Zahari Ahmad Shah, a seasoned captain at 53, was at the helm. Known simply as Zahari, he was a respected figure at Malaysian Airlines, married with 3 grown children, and resided in a gated community where he owned 2 homes. Zahari had a passion for flight simulation, having set up an intricate Microsoft flight simulator in one of his houses, and he frequently engaged with online forums about his hobby. In the cockpit, Farik showed deference to Zahari, who was known for his approachable demeanor. In the cabin, there were 10 Malaysian flight attendants responsible for 227 passengers, including 5 children. The majority of the passengers were Chinese, with the rest hailing from Malaysia 38, Indonesia, Australia, India, France, the United States, Iran, Ukraine, Canada, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Russia, and Taiwan. In the cockpit, First Officer Farik piloted the plane while Captain Zahari managed the radio communications. This setup was standard, but Zahari's transmissions were somewhat unusual. At 1:01 a.m., he reported that they had leveled off at 35,000 feet, a redundant update in radar-monitored airspace, where it's customary to report leaving an altitude, not reaching one. At 1:08 a.m., the flight crossed the Malaysian coastline and headed over the South China Sea towards Vietnam. Zahari again confirmed the plane's altitude at 35,000 feet. 11 minutes later, as the plane approached a waypoint near Vietnamese airspace, the Kuala Lumpur Center controller radioed.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9, good night.
Zahari responded.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
He did not repeat the frequency, as protocol required, but otherwise, the transmission seemed normal. This was the last communication from MH370. The pilots never contacted Ho Chi Minh or responded to subsequent attempts to reach them. Primary radar uses basic pings off objects in the sky, while air traffic control systems rely on secondary radar, which uses a transponder signal from each airplane that provides more detailed information, such as the plane's identity and altitude. 5 seconds after MH370 entered Vietnamese airspace, its transponder signal vanished from Malaysian air traffic control screens, and 37 seconds later, the entire plane disappeared from secondary radar. The time was 1:21 a.m., 39 minutes after takeoff. The Kuala Lumpur controller, preoccupied with other traffic, didn't notice immediately. When he did, he assumed the plane was under Ho Chi Minh's control, beyond his range. Meanwhile, Vietnamese controllers saw MH370 enter their airspace and then disappear from radar. They misunderstood an agreement that required Ho Chi Minh to inform Kuala Lumpur immediately if a handed-off plane was more than 5 minutes late checking in. They repeatedly tried to contact the aircraft without success. By the time they informed Kuala Lumpur, 18 minutes had passed since MH370 vanished from their radar. What followed was a series of miscommunications and delays. Kuala Lumpur's Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center should have been alerted within an hour of the disappearance, but by 2:30 a.m., it still hadn't been. An emergency response was finally initiated 4 hours later, at 6:32 a.m. The enigma of MH370 has captivated ongoing investigations and sparked intense public speculation. At the time it vanished, the plane was supposed to be landing in Beijing. Initially, the search was concentrated in the South China Sea, between Malaysia and Vietnam, involving an international effort of 34 ships and 28 aircraft from 7 countries. However, MH370 was far from that area. Within days, primary radar data from air traffic control, corroborated by secret Malaysian Air Force records, revealed that after disappearing from secondary radar, MH370 made a sharp turn southwest, flew back over the Malay Peninsula, and circled around Penang Island. It then flew northwest up the Strait of Malacca and into the Andaman Sea, where it vanished from radar. This part of the flight took over an hour, suggesting it wasn't a typical hijacking, accident, or pilot suicide scenario. From the beginning, MH370 led investigators into uncharted territory. The mystery of MH370 has been a focal point of continuous investigation and fervent public speculation. The loss affected families across 4 continents. The notion that a sophisticated aircraft, equipped with modern instruments and redundant communications, could simply disappear seems implausible. In an age where even deleting an email permanently is difficult and living off the grid is nearly impossible, the disappearance of a Boeing 777, designed to be electronically accessible at all times, is baffling. This incident has given rise to numerous theories, many of which are outlandish. Yet they persist because, in today's world, commercial airplanes don't just vanish. But this one did, and over 5 years later, its exact location remains unknown. Despite this, much about MH370's disappearance has become clearer, allowing for a reconstruction of that night's events. While the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder may never be found, the crucial information we need is unlikely to come from the black boxes. Instead, it will have to come from Malaysia. The Beachcomber. On the night the airplane vanished, Blaine Gibson, a middle-aged American, was in his late mother's house in Carmel, California, sorting through her belongings to prepare the property for sale. He learned about MH370's disappearance from CNN. Gibson, whom I recently met in Kuala Lumpur, is a trained lawyer. Although he has lived in Seattle for over 35 years, he spends little time there. His father, a World War I veteran who survived a mustard gas attack and received a Silver Star for bravery, served as California's Chief Justice for more than 24 years. His mother, a Stanford Law School graduate and passionate environmentalist, passed away recently. As an only child, Gibson often traveled internationally with his mother. At age 7, he decided his life's mission was to visit every country in the world at least once. This goal challenged the definitions of visit and country. But he remained committed, foregoing a stable career and living off a modest inheritance. Along the way, he explored famous mysteries like the end of the Mayan civilization in Guatemala and Belize, the Tunguska meteor explosion in Siberia, and the Ark of the Covenant's location in Ethiopia. He printed cards identifying himself as an adventurer, explorer, and truth seeker, and wore a fedora like Indiana Jones. When MH370 disappeared, he was naturally intrigued. Despite initial denials and obfuscation by Malaysian officials and the Air Force, the truth about the airplane's unusual flight path soon emerged. MH370 continued to intermittently connect with a geostationary Indian Ocean satellite operated by Inmarsat, a London-based commercial vendor, for 6 hours after disappearing from secondary radar. This indicated that the airplane had not experienced a sudden catastrophic event. During those 6 hours, it likely remained in high-speed, high-altitude cruising flight. The Inmarsat link-ups, known as handshakes, were routine electronic connections that provided minimal communication, as passenger entertainment, cockpit texts, and automated maintenance reports had been isolated or switched off. There were 7 link-ups in total, 2 initiated automatically by the airplane and 5 by the Inmarsat ground station. Additionally, 2 satellite phone calls went unanswered but provided extra data. Most of these connections included 2 values that Inmarsat had only recently begun to log. The first and more accurate value, known as the burst timing offset or distance value, measures the transmission time to and from the airplane, indicating its distance from the satellite. This does not pinpoint a single location, but rather a circular set of possibilities. Given MH370's range limits, these circles can be reduced to arcs. The most crucial arc is the 7th and final one, defined by a last handshake linked to fuel exhaustion and engine failure. This 7th arc stretches from Central Asia to near Antarctica. MH370 crossed it at 8:19 a.m. Kuala Lumpur time. Calculations of likely flight paths suggest the airplane's endpoint could be in Kazakhstan if it turned north, or in the southern Indian Ocean if it turned south. Based on the electronic evidence, it appears that the airplane did not attempt a controlled water landing. Instead, it likely shattered into countless fragments upon impact. Technical analysis strongly suggests that the airplane turned south, as indicated by Inmarsat's second logged value, known as the burst frequency offset, or Doppler value. This value measures radio frequency Doppler shifts caused by high-speed movement relative to the satellite's position, which is a standard aspect of satellite communications for aircraft. These Doppler shifts must be predicted and compensated for by onboard systems to ensure proper satellite communication. However, this compensation is not always perfect due to factors like satellite orbit tilts and temperature variations, especially as satellites age. These imperfections leave detectable traces. Although Doppler shift logs had never been used before to locate an airplane, Inmarsat technicians in London identified a significant distortion indicating a turn to the south at 2:40 a.m. This turn occurred slightly north and west of Sumatra, Indonesia's northernmost island. It is assumed, with some analytical risk, that the airplane then flew straight and level for a long time towards Antarctica, which was beyond its range. After 6 hours, the Doppler data showed a steep descent, up to 5 times greater than a normal descent rate. Within a minute or two of crossing the 7th arc, the plane plunged into the ocean, possibly shedding parts before impact. The electronic evidence suggests this was not a controlled water landing, and the airplane likely shattered into numerous pieces. However, the exact location of the impact and the reasons behind it remained unknown, with no physical evidence to confirm the satellite data. Less than a week after the disappearance, the Wall Street Journal reported on the satellite transmissions, indicating that the airplane likely remained airborne for hours after losing contact. Malaysian officials eventually confirmed this account. The Malaysian government, known for its corruption, was also secretive, fearful, and unreliable in its investigation. Accident investigators from Europe, Australia, and the United States were shocked by the disarray they encountered. Due to the Malaysians withholding information, initial sea searches focused on the wrong area, the South China Sea, yielding no floating debris. If the Malaysians had been truthful from the start, debris might have been found, helping to locate the airplane and recover the black boxes. The underwater search eventually focused on a narrow swath of ocean thousands of miles away. However, even a narrow swath of the ocean is vast. It took 2 years to find the black boxes from Air France 447, which crashed into the Atlantic on a flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris in 2009, despite searchers knowing exactly where to look. The initial search of surface waters concluded in April 2014 after nearly 2 months of unsuccessful efforts, shifting the focus to the ocean depths, where it remains today. Blaine Gibson initially observed the frustration from afar. He sold his mother's house and relocated to the Golden Triangle of northern Laos, where he and a business partner began building a restaurant on the Mekong River. He joined a Facebook group dedicated to the loss of MH370, which was filled with speculation but also useful insights about what might have happened to the airplane and where the main wreckage could be found. Although the Malaysians were nominally in charge of the investigation, they lacked the resources and expertise for a subsea search and recovery effort. The Australians, as good international citizens, took the lead. The areas of the Indian Ocean indicated by satellite data about 1,200 miles southwest of Perth were so deep and unexplored that the first challenge was to map the undersea topography sufficiently to allow side-scanning sonar vehicles to be safely towed miles beneath the surface. The ocean floor was lined with ridges in a blackness where light had never penetrated. Gibson began to wonder if, despite the strenuous underwater searching, debris from the airplane might someday simply wash up on a beach somewhere. While visiting friends on the coast of Cambodia, he asked if they had stumbled upon anything. They had not. Debris couldn't possibly have drifted to Cambodia from the southern Indian Ocean, but until the airplane's wreckage was found proving that the southern Indian Ocean was indeed its grave, Gibson was determined to keep an open mind. In March 2015, a one-year commemoration of MH370's disappearance was held in Kuala Lumpur by the passengers' next of kin. Uninvited and largely unknown to them, Gibson decided to attend. Because he had no special knowledge to offer, his arrival raised eyebrows. People didn't know what to make of a dilettante. The commemoration took place in an outdoor space at a shopping mall, a typical event venue for Kuala Lumpur. The purpose was to grieve collectively, but also to maintain pressure on the Malaysian government to provide explanations. Hundreds of people attended, many from China. There was a bit of music on a stage. In the background, a large poster showed the silhouette of a Boeing 777, along with the words where, who, why, when, whom, how, and also impossible, unprecedented, vanished, and clueless. The principal speaker was a young Malaysian woman named Grace Subathirai Nathan, whose mother had been on the flight. Nathan is a criminal defense lawyer specializing in death penalty cases, of which Malaysia has many due to draconian laws. She had emerged as the most effective representative of the next of kin. She took to the stage wearing an oversized t-shirt printed with a cartoon graphic of MH370 and the exhortation search on, and then proceeded to describe her mother, the deep love she felt for her, and the difficulty of enduring her disappearance. On occasion, she quietly wept, as did some in the audience, including Gibson. Afterward, he approached Nathan and asked if she would accept a hug from a stranger. She did, and they became friends. Gibson left the commemoration determined to help by addressing a gap he had perceived: the lack of coastal searches for floating debris. This would be his niche. He would become MH370's private beachcomber. The official investigators, primarily Australian and Malaysian, were heavily invested in their underwater search. They would have scoffed at Gibson's ambition, just as they would have scoffed at the prospect that on beaches hundreds of miles apart, Gibson would find pieces of the airplane. The mother lode. The Indian Ocean laps against countless miles of coastline, depending on how many islands you count. When Blaine Gibson began his search for debris, he had no concrete plan. He traveled to Myanmar, a destination he had already intended to visit, and inquired with local villagers about where flotsam typically washed ashore. They pointed him to several beaches, and a fisherman took him there by boat. He found some debris, but none from an airplane. He advised the villagers to keep an eye out, left his contact information, and moved on. Similarly, he visited the Maldives and the islands of Rodrigues and Mauritius without finding any significant debris. Then, on July 29, 2015, about 16 months after the airplane went missing, a municipal beach cleanup crew on the French island of Réunion discovered a torn piece of airfoil about 6 feet long that appeared to have just washed ashore. The crew foreman, Johnny Bigu, realized it might be from an airplane but had no idea which one. He briefly considered turning it into a memorial but instead called a local radio station with the news. A team of gendarmes arrived and took the piece away. It was quickly identified as part of a Boeing 777, specifically a flaperon attached to the trailing edge of the wings. Subsequent examination of serial numbers confirmed it was from MH370. This provided the necessary physical evidence to support the electronic data, indicating that the flight had ended violently in the Indian Ocean, albeit somewhere still unknown and thousands of miles east of Reunion. The families of those on board had to confront the reality that their loved ones were not coming back. Grace Nathan was devastated, telling me she could barely function for weeks after the flaperon was found. Gibson flew to Reunion and met Johnny Bigueux on his beach. Bigueux was friendly and showed Gibson where he had found the flaperon. Gibson searched for other debris but had low expectations, as the French government had already conducted a follow-up search without success. Flotsam takes time to drift across the Indian Ocean, moving from east to west at low southern latitudes, and a flaperon might arrive sooner than other debris because parts of it could act as a sail. A local newspaper reporter interviewed Gibson about his visit. Gibson wore a search t-shirt for the occasion. He then traveled to Australia, where he consulted with two oceanographers, Charitha Pattiarachi from the University of Western Australia and David Griffin from a government research centre in Hobart. Both were experts on Indian Ocean currents and winds. Griffin, in particular, had spent years tracking drift buoys and had launched an effort to model the drift characteristics of the flaperon during its journey to Reunion, hoping to backtrack and narrow the search area. Gibson's needs were simpler. He wanted to know the most likely locations for floating debris to come ashore. The answer was the northeast coast of Madagascar and, to a lesser extent, the coast of Mozambique. Gibson chose Mozambique because he had never been there and could add it as his 177th country. He selected the town of Vilanculos for its safety and nice beaches. In February 2016, he arrived and asked local fishermen for advice. They directed him to a sandbank called Paluma, beyond a reef, where fishermen collected nets and buoys from the Indian Ocean. Gibson paid a boatman named Suleiman to take him there. They found various junk, mostly plastic. Suleiman called Gibson over, holding up a gray triangular scrap about 2 feet across, and asked, "Is this 370?" The scrap had a honeycomb structure and the words "no step" stenciled on one surface. Gibson initially doubted it came from a large airplane, but felt it might be from the plane. As they returned, 2 dolphins appeared and guided them off the sandbank, Gibson's mother's spirit animal. Seeing the dolphins, he thought, "This is from the plane." Gibson was right. The scrap, from a horizontal stabilizer panel, was almost certainly from MH370. He flew to the capital, Maputo, and handed the debris to the Australian consul. Then he flew to Kuala Lumpur, just in time for the 2nd anniversary commemoration, where he was welcomed as a friend. In June 2016, Gibson turned his attention to the remote northeastern shores of Madagascar. This proved to be the mother lode. He found 3 pieces on the first day and another 2 a few days later. The following week, on a beach 8 miles away, 3 more pieces were delivered to him. Word spread that he would pay for MH370 debris. He once paid $40 for a piece, leading an entire village to go on a day-long celebration. Much of the debris had nothing to do with the airplane. However, of the several dozen pieces identified as certain, likely, or suspected to be from MH370, Gibson discovered roughly a third. Some pieces are still being investigated. Gibson's influence has been so significant that David Griffin, though grateful, worried that the perceived debris pattern might be skewed toward Madagascar, potentially at the expense of points farther north. He called this concern the Gibson effect. Despite 5 years of searching, no one has been able to trace the debris back to its origin in the southern Indian Ocean. Gibson remains hopeful of finding new debris that will explain the disappearance, charred wiring indicating a fire or shrapnel-peppered evidence of a missile strike, though the known facts about the flight's final hours largely rule out such possibilities. Gibson's discovery of so much debris confirmed the signal's analysis was correct. The airplane flew for 6 hours before coming to a sudden end. There was no attempt to bring the airplane down gently, it shattered. Gibson still hopes to find a message in a bottle, a note of desperation scribbled by someone in their last moments. On the beaches, he has found a few backpacks and many purses, all empty. The closest he came to finding such a note was a message written in Malay on the underside of a baseball cap, which read, "To whom it may concern. My dear friend, meet me at the guest house later." The Conspiracies. Following the disappearance of MH370, 3 official investigations were launched. The first, and most extensive, was the Australian underwater search effort. This technically advanced and costly operation aimed to locate the main debris and retrieve the airplane's flight data and cockpit voice recorders. It involved complex calculations of aircraft performance, analysis of radar and satellite records, studies of oceanic drift, statistical analysis, and physical examination of East African flotsam, much of which was found by Blaine Gibson. The search required heavy maritime operations in some of the world's roughest seas. A group of volunteer engineers and scientists, known as the Independent Group, collaborated online and provided valuable insights that were acknowledged by the Australians. Despite over 3 years of effort and approximately $160 million spent, the search ended without success. In 2018, an American company, Ocean Infinity, took over the search under a no-find, no-fee contract with the Malaysian government. Using advanced underwater surveillance vehicles, they covered a new section of the 7th Arc, identified by the Independent Group as the most likely area to yield results. However, this search also ended in failure after a few months. The second investigation was conducted by the Malaysian police and involved background checks on everyone on the airplane and some of their friends. The full extent of the police discoveries remains unclear, as the resulting report was stamped secret and withheld from other Malaysian investigators. After the report was leaked, its inadequacies became apparent, particularly regarding the information about the captain, Zahari. The Prime Minister at the time, Najib Razak, was alleged to be corrupt, and the press in Malaysia was censored. Troublemakers were being picked up and made to disappear, leading officials to exercise caution to protect their careers and possibly their lives. It was evident that certain avenues were not pursued to avoid reflecting poorly on Malaysia Airlines or the government. The third investigation was the accident inquiry, intended to find probable cause rather than adjudicate liability. Conducted by an international team led by an ad hoc working group assembled by the Malaysian government, the investigation was chaotic from the start. The police and military disdained it, and government ministers saw it as a risk. Foreign specialists sent to assist began retreating almost immediately. An American expert noted that the International Aviation Protocol, Annex 13, is tailored for accident investigations in confident democracies, but it was a poor fit for countries like Malaysia with insecure and autocratic bureaucracies and government-owned airlines. A close observer of the MH370 process remarked that the primary objective of the Malaysians was to make the subject disappear. From the beginning, there was an instinctive bias against being open and transparent, not because they were hiding a deep, dark secret, but because they did not know where the truth lay and feared that something embarrassing might emerge. They were covering up for the unknown. In the end, the investigation produced a 495-page report that was a weak imitation of Annex 13 requirements. It was filled with boilerplate descriptions of 777 systems lifted from Boeing manuals and offered no technical value. The report's only real contribution was a frank description of the air traffic control failures, presumably because half of them could be blamed on the Vietnamese, and the Malaysian controllers were the weakest local target politically. The report, released in July 2018, more than 4 years after the event, stated that the investigative team was unable to determine the cause of the airplane's disappearance. The notion that a highly advanced machine, equipped with modern instruments and multiple communication systems, could simply disappear seemed inconceivable. This conclusion fuels ongoing speculation, even if it's unfounded. The satellite data offers the most reliable evidence of the airplane's flight path, and it's difficult to dispute. However, people need to trust the numbers to believe the story they tell. Various theorists have made claims, amplified by social media, that disregard the satellite data, radar tracks, aircraft systems, air traffic control records, the physics of flight, and basic planetary geography. For instance, a British woman who blogs under the name Saucy Sailoress and offers tarot readings for hire was traveling around southern Asia with her husband and dogs in an ocean-going sailboat. She claims that on the night MH370 disappeared, They were in the Andaman Sea, and she saw what appeared to be a cruise missile heading towards her. The missile transformed into a low-flying airplane with a well-lit cockpit, bathed in an eerie orange glow and trailing smoke. As it flew by, she concluded it was on a suicide mission against a Chinese naval fleet farther out to sea. She didn't know about the disappearance of MH370 at the time, but when she learned of it a few days later, she made what seemed to her an obvious connection. Implausible as it may be, she gained an audience. An Australian has been claiming for years to have found MH370 using Google Earth. In shallow waters and intact, he has refused to disclose the location while he works on crowdfunding an expedition. Online, you'll find claims that the airplane has been found intact in the Cambodian jungle, that it was seen landing in an Indonesian river, that it flew into a time warp, or that it was sucked into a black hole. One theory suggests the airplane was flying off to attack the American military base on Diego Garcia before being shot down. A recent online report claimed that Captain Zahari had been found alive and was lying in a Taiwanese hospital with amnesia, which Malaysia angrily denied. The news came from a crudely satirical website that also reported a sexual assault on an American trekker and 2 Sherpas by a Yeti-like creature in Nepal. A New York-based writer named Jeff Wise has hypothesized that one of the electronic systems on board the airplane may have been reprogrammed to provide false data indicating a turn south into the Indian Ocean when the airplane actually turned north toward Kazakhstan to mislead investigators. He calls this the spoof scenario and has elaborated extensively on it, most recently in a 2019 ebook. He suggests that the Russians might have stolen the airplane to create a distraction from the annexation of Crimea, then underway. A significant flaw in this argument is explaining how, if the airplane was flown to Kazakhstan, all that wreckage ended up in the Indian Ocean. Wise's answer is that it was planted. Blaine Gibson was new to social media when he began his search, and he was in for a shock. As he recalls, trolls emerged as soon as he found his first piece, the one labeled "No Step," and they multiplied afterward, especially as the beaches of Madagascar began to yield results. The internet provokes emotion even in response to mundane events. A catastrophe taps into something toxic. Gibson was accused of exploiting the families, being a fraud, a publicity hound, a drug addict, a Russian agent, an American agent, and at the very least a dupe. He began receiving death threats messages on social media and phone calls to friends predicting his demise. One message said that either he would stop looking for debris or he would leave Madagascar in a coffin. Another warned that he would die of polonium poisoning. There were more. He was not prepared for this and couldn't shrug it off. During the days I spent with him in Kuala Lumpur, he kept up with the latest attacks with the help of a friend in London. He said, "I once made the mistake of going on Twitter. Basically, these people are cyber terrorists, and it works. It's effective. He has been traumatized." In 2017, Gibson arranged a formal mechanism for the transfer of debris. He would turn over any new finds to authorities in Madagascar, who would hand them to Malaysia's honorary consul, who would pack them up and ship them to Kuala Lumpur for examination and storage. On August 24th of that year, the honorary consul was gunned down in his car by an assassin who escaped on a motorcycle and has never been found. A French-language news account alleged that the consul had a shady past. His killing may have had no connection to MH370 at all. Gibson, however, believes there is a connection. A police investigation is ongoing. He now takes great care to keep his whereabouts and travel plans under wraps. For similar reasons, he avoids using email and seldom speaks on the phone. Instead, he prefers encrypted communication methods like Skype and WhatsApp. He often changes his SIM cards and believes he is sometimes followed and photographed. It's undeniable that Gibson is the only person who has independently searched for and found debris from MH370. However, the notion that the debris is worth killing for seems far-fetched. It would be more plausible if the debris contained clues to dark secrets or international intrigue. Yet the evidence, much of which is now public, suggests otherwise. The possibilities. A significant amount of information can now be ascertained with certainty regarding the fate of MH370. Firstly, the disappearance was a deliberate act. It is implausible that the known flight path, coupled with radio and electronic silence, resulted from any combination of system failure and human error. Factors such as computer glitches, control system collapses, squall lines, ice, lightning strikes, bird strikes, meteorites, volcanic ash, mechanical failures, sensor failures, instrument failures, radio failures, electrical failures, fires, smoke, explosive decompressions, cargo explosions, pilot confusion, medical emergencies, bombs, wars, or acts of God, none of these can account for the flight path. Secondly, contrary to some theories, control of the plane was not seized remotely from the electrical equipment bay, located under the forward galley. Extensive explanations could be provided as to why this is the case. Control was taken from within the cockpit. This occurred within the 20-minute window from 1:01 a.m., when the airplane leveled at 35,000 feet, to 1:21 a.m., when it vanished from secondary radar. During this period, the airplane's automatic condition reporting system sent its regular 30-minute update via satellite to the airline's maintenance department. It reported fuel levels, altitude, speed, and geographic position, indicating no anomalies. This transmission confirmed that the airplane's satellite communication system was operational at that time. By the time the airplane disappeared from secondary transponder-enhanced radar, it is likely, given the improbability of two pilots acting in unison, that one of them was incapacitated or deceased, or had been locked out of the cockpit. Primary radar records, both military and civilian, later indicated that whoever was flying MH370 must have disengaged the autopilot, as the turn the airplane made to the southwest was so sharp that it had to have been manually flown. Circumstances suggest that the individual at the controls intentionally depressurized the airplane. Around the same time, much if not all of the electrical system was deliberately shut down. The reasons for this shutdown remain unknown. However, one of its effects was to temporarily sever the satellite link. An electrical engineer from Boulder, Colorado, named Mike Exner, who is a prominent member of the independent group, has extensively studied the radar data. He believes that during the turn, the airplane ascended to 40,000 feet, which was near its limit. During this maneuver, the passengers would have experienced some G-forces, that sensation of being suddenly pressed back into the seat. Exner theorizes that the purpose of the climb was to hasten the effects of depressurizing the airplane, leading to the rapid incapacitation and death of everyone in the cabin. Within a few minutes, the cabin occupants would have become incapacitated, lost consciousness, and peacefully passed away without any signs of choking or gasping for air. Intentional depressurization would have been an obvious and likely the only way to subdue a potentially unruly cabin on a flight that was going to remain airborne for hours. In the cabin, the effect would have gone unnoticed, except for the sudden appearance of the drop-down oxygen masks and perhaps the cabin crew's use of the few portable units of similar design. These cabin masks were only intended for about 15 minutes of use during emergency descents to altitudes below 13,000 feet. They would have been useless at cruising altitudes of 40,000 feet. In contrast, the cockpit was equipped with 4 pressurized oxygen masks linked to hours of supply. Whoever depressurized the airplane would have simply had to put one on. The airplane was moving fast. On primary radar, it appeared as an unidentified blip approaching the island of Penang at nearly 600 miles an hour. The nearby mainland is home to Butterworth Air Base, where a squadron of Malaysian F-18 interceptors is stationed, along with an air defense radar, not that anyone was paying attention. According to a former official, before the accident report was released last summer, Malaysian Air Force officers demanded to review and edit it in a section called Malaysian Military Radar. The report provides a timeline suggesting that the air defense radar had been actively monitored, that the military was well aware of the identity of the aircraft, and that it purposefully did not pursue to intercept the aircraft since it was friendly and did not pose any threat to national airspace security, integrity, and sovereignty. The question, of course, is why, if the military knew the airplane had turned around and was flying west, it then allowed the search to continue for days in the wrong body of water, to the east. Despite all its expensive equipment, the Air Force had failed at its job and could not bring itself to admit the fact. In an Australian television interview, the former Malaysian defense minister said, "If you're not going to shoot it down, what's the point in sending an interceptor up?" Well, for one thing, you could positively identify the airplane, which at this point was just a blip on primary radar. You could also look through the windows into the cockpit and see who was at the controls. At 1:37 a.m., MH370's regularly scheduled 30-minute automatic condition reporting system failed to transmit. We now know that the system had been isolated from any satellite transmission, something easily done from within the cockpit, and therefore could not send out any of its scheduled reports. At 1:52 a.m., about half an hour into the diversion, MH370 flew just south of Penang Island, made a broad right turn, and headed northwest up the Strait of Malacca. During this turn, the first officer's cell phone briefly connected with a tower below, though no content was transmitted. 11 minutes later, assuming MH370 was still over the South China Sea, a Malaysia Airlines dispatcher sent a text message instructing the pilots to contact Ho Chi Minh's Air Traffic Control Center. The message went unanswered. Throughout the Strait of Malacca, the airplane continued to be hand-flown, and it is presumed that everyone in the cabin was dead by this point. At 2:22 a.m., the Malaysian Air Force radar picked up the last blip. The airplane was 230 miles northwest of Penang, heading northwest into the Andaman Sea and flying fast. 3 minutes later, at 2:25, the airplane's satellite box suddenly came back to life. This likely occurred when the full electrical system was restored, and the airplane was repressurized at the same time. When the satellite box reactivated, it sent a log on request to Inmarsat. The ground station responded, and the first link-up was accomplished. Unbeknownst to anyone in the cockpit, the relevant distance and Doppler values were recorded at the ground station, later allowing the first arc to be established. A few minutes later, a dispatcher called the airplane. The satellite box accepted the link, but the call went unanswered. An associated Doppler value showed that the airplane had just made a wide turn to the south. Investigators referred to this location as the final major turn. Its location is crucial to all subsequent efforts, but it has never been precisely determined. Indonesian air defense radar should have detected it, but the radar seems to have been turned off for the night. MH370 was now most likely flying on autopilot, cruising south into the night. Whoever was in the cockpit was active and alive. Was this a hijacking? A hijacking is the third-party solution favored in the official report. It is the least painful explanation for anyone in authority that night. However, it has immense problems. The main one is that the cockpit door was fortified, electrically bolted, and surveilled by a video feed that the pilots could see. Additionally, less than 2 minutes passed between Zahari's casual goodnight to the Kuala Lumpur controller and the start of the diversion, with the attendant loss of the transponder signal. How would hijackers have known to make their move precisely during the handoff to Vietnamese air traffic control, and then gained access so quickly and smoothly that neither of the pilots had a chance to transmit a distress call? It is possible, of course, that the hijackers were known to the pilots that they were invited into the cockpit, but even that does not explain the lack of a radio transmission, particularly during the hand-flown turn away from Beijing. Both of the control yokes had transmitter switches within the merest finger reach, and some signal could have been sent in the moments before an attempted takeover. Furthermore, every one of the passengers and cabin crew members has been investigated and cleared of suspicion by teams of Malaysian and Chinese investigators aided by the FBI. The quality of that police work is open to question, but it was thorough enough to uncover the identities of two Iranians who were traveling under false names with stolen passports, seeking, however, nothing more nefarious than political asylum in Germany. It is possible that stowaways, by definition unrecorded on the airplane's manifest, had hidden in the equipment bay. If so, they would have had access to two circuit breakers that, if pulled, would have unbolted the cockpit door. But that scenario has problems too. The bolts click loudly when they open, an unambiguous sound that would have been familiar to the pilots. The hijackers would then have had to open a galley floor hatch from below, climb a short ladder, evade notice by the cabin crew, evade the surveillance video, and enter the cockpit before either of the pilots transmitted a distress call. It is unlikely that this could have happened, just as it is unlikely that a flight attendant held hostage could have used the door keypad to allow sudden entry without firing off a warning. Furthermore, what would the purpose be of a hijacking? Money? Politics? Publicity? An act of war? A terrorist attack? The intricate 7-hour profile of MH370's deviation into oblivion fits none of these scenarios, and no one has claimed responsibility for the act. Anonymity is not consistent with any of these motives. Captain. This brings us to a different kind of disaster, an internal hijacking, where no forced entry is needed, committed by a pilot who goes rogue. Many might struggle to accept the idea that a pilot would intentionally kill hundreds of innocent passengers in a murder-suicide. However, history has shown that it is not without precedent. In 1997, a Silkair captain is believed to have disabled the black boxes of a Boeing 737 before deliberately crashing the plane into a river at supersonic speeds. 2 years later, in 1999, Egyptair Flight 990 was deliberately crashed into the ocean by its co-pilot off the coast of Long Island, resulting in the loss of everyone on board. In 2013, just months before MH370 vanished, the captain of LAM Mozambique Airlines Flight 470 intentionally flew his Embraer E190 into the ground, killing all 33 people aboard. The most recent incident occurred on March 24, 2015, when the co-pilot of a Germanwings Airbus intentionally crashed the plane into the French Alps, killing everyone on board. Andreas Lubitz, the co-pilot, had locked the pilot out of the cockpit after he went to the bathroom. Investigations later revealed Lubitz had a history of depression and had researched the disappearance of MH370 just a year earlier. In the case of MH370, it is hard to view the co-pilot as the likely perpetrator. He was young, optimistic, and reportedly planning to get married. There were no signs of trouble, dissent, or personal doubts in his history. Unlike a German pilot stuck in the declining industry of budget airlines with low salaries and even lower prestige, he was flying a prestigious Boeing 777 in a country where the national airline and its pilots are still highly respected. On the other hand, it is the captain, Zahari, who raises concerns. The official reports paint him as a model pilot and a calm family man with a hobby for flight simulators, an image strongly upheld by his family. However, multiple troubling signs have emerged, suggesting that this portrayal may have glossed over more significant issues. The Malaysian police report withheld key information about Captain Zahari, which came as no surprise. Investigators uncovered elements of his life that warranted a more thorough investigation, yet their formal conclusions fell short. The official report, which referred to Zahari as the PIC pilot in command, stated the following. The PIC's ability to handle stress at work was reported to be good. There was no known history of apathy, anxiety, or irritability. There were no significant changes in his lifestyle, interpersonal conflict, or family stresses. There were no behavioral signs of social isolation, change of habits, or interest. On studying the PIC's behavioral pattern on the CCTV at the airport on the day of the flight and prior 3 flights, there were no significant behavioral changes observed. On all the CCTV recordings, the appearance was similar, i.e. well-groomed and attired. The gait, posture, facial expressions, and mannerisms were his normal characteristics. Zahari's portrayal as a stable and content individual was either inaccurate or conflicted with what could be known about him. From conversations I had in Kuala Lumpur with those familiar with him, it became clear that Zahari was often lonely and emotionally troubled. His wife had moved out and was living in the family's second home, leaving Zahari to spend much of his time alone, pacing through empty rooms, waiting for the days between flights to pass. He had a romantic side, which led to a longing relationship with a married woman and her 3 children, one of whom was disabled. He also appeared fixated on 2 young internet models, whom he followed on social media. Zahari left shyly suggestive comments on their posts, though these comments seemingly went unnoticed. For instance, he once remarked that a girl in a robe looked like she had just stepped out of a shower. It became apparent that Zahari was drifting from the more structured life he had once led. Although he kept in contact with his grown children, they had moved on. His frequent use of social media, which often fosters feelings of isolation, likely worsened his sense of disconnection. Investigators from aviation and intelligence circles strongly suspect that Zahari may have been clinically depressed. In a country like Malaysia, where uncomfortable truths are often suppressed in official narratives, the police's portrayal of Zahari as a healthy and happy man is hard to take at face value. The omission of evidence to the contrary only reinforces the notion that Zahari was a deeply troubled individual. Forensic examinations of Zahari's flight simulator by the FBI revealed that he had experimented with a flight profile closely resembling that of MH370, initially flying north around Indonesia, followed by a long journey south, ultimately ending in fuel exhaustion over the Indian Ocean. While Malaysian investigators dismissed this profile as just one of many recorded by the simulator, this viewpoint fails to capture crucial details. Victor Ianello, an engineer and prominent member of the independent group, has conducted extensive analyses of the simulated flight and highlights what was overlooked by Malaysian authorities. Notably, the profile that mirrored MH370's trajectory was the only one that Zahari did not run as a continuous flight. Instead, he manually advanced the simulation in stages, adjusting the fuel as needed until it ran out. Ianello believes Zahari was responsible for the diversion and suspects that the simulator flight might have served as a way to leave a breadcrumb trail, a farewell of sorts, since there was little to gain technically from rehearsing such an act on a consumer-grade product. He remarked that it was as if Zahari was simulating a simulation, while Zahari's true motivations remain a mystery. The simulator flight cannot be easily dismissed as mere coincidence. In Kuala Lumpur, I spoke with one of Zahari's lifelong friends, a fellow 777 captain whose name I've withheld to protect him. He reluctantly concluded that Zahari was guilty. He likened the mystery to a pyramid, broad at the base but narrowing to one point at the top, suggesting that while many explanations may have emerged, they ultimately led to a single conclusion. "It doesn't make sense," he said. "It's hard to reconcile with the man I knew, but it's the necessary conclusion." I inquired about Zahari's relationship with First Officer Farik Hamid. "That's simple," he replied. "Zahari was an examiner. All he had to say was, 'Go check something in the cabin,' and Farik would have left the cockpit." When I pressed for a motive, he was uncertain. Zahari's marriage was troubled. He had affairs with some flight attendants, but who doesn't? "You're traveling the world with these beautiful women." His wife knew, though, he added. While he felt this wasn't enough reason for Zahari to go off the deep end, he believed his emotional state could have played a role. The absence of Zahari's personal struggles, the unusual flight profile on the simulator, and the report's technical shortcomings raise the question of whether a cover-up is at play. At this point, we can't say for sure. We know some of what investigators were aware of but chose not to disclose, and there may be even more we still don't know. This brings us back to the fate of MH370. One can easily envision Zahari in the cockpit during those final moments, comfortably secured in his seat, enveloped by the soft glow of familiar instruments, fully aware that there was no turning back from his actions and feeling no urgency. He would have long since repressurized the cabin and adjusted the temperature to a comfortable level. The cockpit hummed with the sounds of a living machine, illuminated by the gentle glow of screens and thoughtfully lit switches and circuit breakers. Outside, the air flowed smoothly past, creating a serene atmosphere. The cockpit, after all, is the ultimate sanctuary, deeply protective and intensely private. Around 7 a.m., the sun rose over the eastern horizon to the left of the aircraft, casting light on the ocean below. Had Zahari already succumbed during the flight? It's possible he had depressurized the cabin again, ending his life in the process, though this remains uncertain. Investigators have speculated, based on fuel exhaustion simulations, that if left to its own devices, the aircraft might not have descended as steeply as the satellite data indicates, suggesting that someone was actively controlling the descent at the end. Regardless, somewhere along the seventh arc, after the engines failed due to fuel depletion, the airplane spiraled downward at alarming rates, possibly exceeding 15,000 feet per minute. This descent rate, combined with the debris discovered by Blaine Gibson, confirms that the plane disintegrated upon impact with the water. The truth. The official investigations have stalled. The Australians have exhausted their efforts. The Chinese, eager to move on, are suppressing any news that might reignite the grief of the families. The French are back in their country, endlessly analyzing satellite data. The Malaysians, meanwhile, seem to wish the whole matter would just disappear. If the wreckage is ever discovered, it will put to rest theories that rely on dismissing the satellite data or ignoring the fact that the plane followed a complex path after its initial turn away from Beijing, remaining airborne for 6 more hours. No, it didn't catch fire and then inexplicably stay in the air. No, it didn't become a ghost flight capable of navigating and toggling its systems on and off. It wasn't shot down after lengthy deliberation by sinister forces, nor is it hidden somewhere in the South China Sea or stashed intact in a secret hangar in Central Asia. What these theories share is that they contradict the credible evidence investigators already have. Even so, finding the wreckage and the 2 black boxes might not yield much. The cockpit voice recorder, a 2-hour loop, likely holds only the final moments of alarms going off unless the person in control decided to leave behind an explanation. The flight data recorder will offer insights into the plane's systems throughout the flight, but it won't reveal a malfunction that could account for the incident. At most, it will answer minor questions, like when exactly the plane was depressurized, how long it remained that way, or how the satellite box was powered down and restarted. While internet sleuths would obsess over the details, it's not an outcome to eagerly anticipate. The key answers likely aren't in the ocean, but on land in Malaysia. That should be the focus moving forward. Unless they're as inept as the Air Force in air traffic control, the Malaysian police probably know more than they've revealed. The mystery may not be so complex, which adds to the frustration. The answers could be within reach, yet harder to uncover than any black box. If Blaine Gibson is looking for a true adventure, he might consider spending a year investigating in Kuala Lumpur.